Hello guys, and welcome to another video. Path of Exile 2's Third Edict update has been fully revealed, including the patch notes with all of the juicy information for new additions, balance updates, and everything else coming in 0.3. Now in this video I'm going to be covering my 3 biggest winners and 3 biggest losers from the 0.3 patch notes. And we're beginning with the winners, with winner number 1, the Blood Mage. This Witch Ascendancy is receiving a huge buff in the Third Edict patch. Previously, one of the biggest complaints about the Blood Mage was all about the very first Ascendancy option, which wasn't really an option at all because you had to take this first notable before moving on to the other parts of the class. This was a forced option. Now, the problem wasn't really about a lack of choice here, as that's the whole flavour of the Ascendancy of the Blood Mage, locking you into life costs for your skills. However, this notable as a first ascension didn't feel like a power boost. In fact, it felt like a power loss. You felt actively punished for ascending, which is terrible. And so, in 0.3, GGG sought to solve this problem, and the way they went about it is to provide this first notable to the Blood Mage for free. That's right, upon speccing into the Blood Mage, you'll be able to allocate Sanguimancy for free, and then spend your first 2 ascension points on nodes beyond the first. This means that you'll now be able to get 15% base spell crit as your first ascension choice, as that notable is also being swapped with Gore Spike in this patch. And this is a big change in and of itself, because usually crit isn't really something you can opt for early, but having such a high base crit right out of the gates will let you scale naturally into crit from a much earlier stage in progression. And that's not all for the Blood Mage, because 2 of the very weak notables on this class were also addressed. Between the Cracks is now Sanguine Tides, and it now provides a very interesting way to utilise your Life Flask for damage, which looks like it can be quite strong if you craft a good flask and solve Flask Sustain. Meanwhile, Open Sores is now Whispers of the Flesh, which reserves 15% of life for targets affected by your curses, and that's going to be very strong, especially against those tanky bosses. The biggest takeaway here though is that the Blood Mage now essentially has 2 extra Ascendancy points to spend, compared to previous patches. And even though Gore Spike took a bit of a nerf, this class still came out so much stronger in patch 0.3 compared to 0.2. Up next in the winners, it's right side builds. Yeah, this one is absolutely baffling to me. I'm not sure why GGG thinks evasion is weak, but apparently it needed a buff, and that's exactly what it got. So right side builds were the dominant subset of builds in 0.2, mostly due to energy shield and evasion hybrid scaling, and in 0.3 they're going to be even more dominant. There are several buffs to builds on the right side of the tree, including improvements to bow skills, buffs to ascendancy classes. Notably, the Deadeye got a nerf to the Avidity notable, but in turn received a huge buff with the changed Cooled Shots notable that will now allow you to auto-mark enemies, a functionality which is mostly gone from other classes in this patch because triggers will no longer be able to socket marks, as they're no longer spells. And in addition to that, the Deadeye can now gain a huge amount of base crit chance from consuming marks with its other newly reworked notable, Eagle Eyes. Yes, it really does look like it's going to be Deadeye League. But part of that is the overall buff to the right side builds and evasion with the addition of the new Deflection stat. Deflect is essentially very similar to PoE1's spell suppression, but it works for all incoming hits. You'll be able to invest into modifiers to provide a portion of evasion rating as deflect rating, and you can potentially scale deflect chance all the way to 100% with enough investment. At which point, you'd be taking 40% less damage from every single incoming hit and any ailments that those hits apply to you. That is wild. That's a crazy buff to right side defenses, and I don't see how Evasion and Energy Shield Hybrid isn't once again going to be king this patch. And the third and final winner for the Third Edict update, it's Weapon Swap. Now this mechanic is something that hasn't really been fully explored in the majority of builds up to this point. Weapon swapping is enabled in PoE2 thanks to the weapon swap specific passive tree points that allow you to spend up to 24 of your points differently based on the weapon set that you have active. and this has been a huge success for a small portion of builds. For example, the Corrupting Cry build from previous updates that used weapon swap to place totems. However, most builds do not utilise this mechanic well, if at all. Now, part of this is that the mechanic will take some time to develop with new additions to support it and new ways of adapting it into builds. But there's also the case of clunkiness. Weapon swapping had a short delay in previous versions of the game, and whilst you could invest into this stat to improve weapon swap speed, most builds couldn't due to location on the tree or lack of build space. But in patch 0.3, the weapon swap delay is being completely removed. That's right, weapon swapping will now be instant. This is a huge change. The impact of this change simply cannot be understated. Even if you're just using weapon swap to immediately switch to a shield to raise it and block incoming hits, you can now do that instantly, which means that it's so much more reliable and as a result, so much more useful. And of course, there will be some extreme abuse cases coming out from this one. I have a feeling GGG may have opened a can of worms with this change. Let's wait and see. And now we move on to the biggest losers for patch 0.3, beginning with Giant's Blood. What on earth am I reading in these patch notes? Not only are right side builds getting buffed, but left side builds, Mace builds, are getting a pretty huge nerf right here in the form of a nerf to Giant's Blood that will halve the amount of life you gain from strength. These builds already have a trivial amount of life, and now they're going to have even less in patch 0.3. And the problem here is that it's not really like Mace builds can afford to not take Giant's Blood. Most builds will still be picking this one up, but the result will be that the majority of Mace builds are now just weaker defensively. The gap in terms of hit pool comparing a life build to CI or hybrid was already ridiculous, and now it will be even worse if you factor in Giant's Blood builds, which make up a huge majority of Mace attack builds. But there's more in this regard, because loser number 2 for the Third Edict update is the Smith of Kitava. Now realistically, the defences granted by this ascendancy may have been a bit too strong, and more of those defences should probably be accessible outside of the ascendancy class to make more classes and ascendancies viable. But these nerfs are quite extreme. The Smith of Kitava lost its 5% maximum fire resistance notable, with it being replaced by a stat that applies 35% of armor to elemental hit damage. But there's a pretty big problem here. The majority of a character's defense is most often gained from the body armor slot, and a Smith of Kitava must be wearing a normal body armor to utilize half of its ascendancy. And that means that generally, this isn't going to be a great option for stacking lots of armor. On top of that, the Inferno Clasp unique belt, which provided up to 6% maximum fire resistance, will be drop disabled in patch 0.3, so that's just a total of 11% maximum fire resistance gone, going from 0.2 to 0.3 for the Smith of Kitava. And there's other changes on the tree and on items to also make access to maximum resistances worse as well. Now, the Smith of Kitava did receive a bizarre update to a small node prior to the living weapon notable, which now grants 5% increased strength. So there's certainly an interesting strength stacking angle on this class that could be pursued, as it already has a 20% increased strength modifier on another notable. But overall, these changes have massively nerfed this ascendancy. And moving on to the third and final loser for patch 0.3, it's Exposure. Now, whilst curses did get a big update in this patch to make them less effective against bosses, they were also updated to provide much more bonuses. And in most cases, you'll be getting the same effect overall, or very close to the same effect on bosses as you were previously when factoring in the less effect modifier, and a lot more impact on any monster rarity below unique. But for Exposure, the same can't be said. These debuffs also received the same treatment, with Exposure having less effect against higher rarity monsters, all the way up to 50% less on bosses. However, the majority of Exposure sources, such as support gems or the passive skill tree, have seemingly been untouched. And so a base 20% Exposure, which had full effect on bosses last patch, will now only lower elemental resistances by 10% on bosses in 0.3. There is one outlier to this though, which is the Frost Bomb skill. Previously, this skill applied cold exposure, and it will now apply elemental exposure, so you can use it for any type of elemental damage build. Frost Bomb is being changed to allow it to apply a much stronger exposure with investment, up to a maximum of 50%. So I expect that most other sources of this debuff will be ignored in patch 0.3, as elemental builds will simply add this skill to their arsenal to ensure that they have the strongest version of the exposure debuff that they can get their hands on. And there you have it, the biggest winners and losers of Path of Exile 2 patch 0.3, the Third Edict. But what are your thoughts on the patch notes? I'm genuinely curious what people think about the Giant's Blood change and the addition of Deflect. Let me know by commenting below, and thanks for watching this video. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.